In the cold, dark waters of Scapa Flow off the northern coast of Scotland, a single bright yellow buoy bobs on the surface of the sea. This floating marker does not warn passing ships of a shallow natural reef, and it does not mark a shifting sandbank or a coastal hazard. It is a Ministry of Defense warning buoy, and it marks the exact center of an invisible, absolute legal boundary. Beneath this buoy lies a strict controlled site that now stretches outward for 350 meters from the designated point. Inside that ring, the law is not merely advisory to dive, salvage, excavate, recover objects, enter the wreckage, or disturb the remains without a license from the Secretary of State for Defense is a criminal offense. Below the dark water, exactly 111 feet down in the permanent twilight of the seabed, lies the shattered hull of the dreadnought battleship Vanguard. This was a massive 19,700-ton war machine of the Royal Navy, built at the height of the global naval arms race. The ship did not sink in a desperate battle. It was never struck by an enemy shell, it was never stalked by a submarine, and it never faced a hostile fleet on the day of its final destruction. The dreadnought obliterated itself in a single instant while sitting quietly at anchor inside the most heavily defended and theoretically secure naval base in the entire British Empire. Today, the wreckage remains completely untouchable, leaving the strange and haunting reality of a warship that destroyed itself in a safe harbor, only to be guarded by a permanent military exclusion zone more than a century later. To understand why the destruction of this specific warship was so physically and psychologically impossible to believe at the time, one must understand the absolute security of the environment where it sank. Vanguard was a St. Vincent-class dreadnought battleship, launched in the year 1909 and designed to dominate the oceans through sheer scale, heavy armor, and devastating firepower. By the summer of 1917, the ship was a vital part of the Grand Fleet, the premier surface fighting force of the Royal Navy. When not engaged in aggressive patrols in the turbulent waters of the North Sea, the vast fleet anchored in Scapa Flow. This enormous natural harbor in the Orkney Islands was the ultimate maritime fortress of the era. The narrow entrances to the harbor were choked with heavy anti-submarine nets, deep underwater minefields, and deliberately sunken blockships to physically bar entry. Heavy coastal artillery batteries watched the approaches from the surrounding cliffs, and thousands of armed sailors stood watch across the anchored armada every single hour of the day. Inside the geographical ring of Scapa Flow, a dreadnought was considered to be entirely shielded from the German surface fleet and the deadly reach of ocean-going submarines. The men aboard Vanguard had survived the chaotic, lethal exchanges of the Battle of Jutland a year earlier, and they had every logical reason to believe that a quiet night at anchor in their heavily guarded home harbor was the safest place on the planet. But the sheer immense scale of early 20th-century warships hid a terrifying vulnerability. The true danger to the ship was not waiting outside the steel anti-submarine nets. The fatal threat was already sealed deep inside the heavily armored hull of the battleship itself. The catastrophe that created the forbidden debris field unfolded rapidly on the night of July 9, 1917. Shortly before midnight, at exactly 23:20, the calm peace of the harbor was instantly shattered by a flash of light so intensely bright that it illuminated the surrounding islands like daylight. A massive, catastrophic internal explosion ripped the center of the heavy battleship completely apart. The sheer kinetic force of the blast was so immense that the thick dreadnought armor was instantly severed into pieces. One of the heavy amidships turret structures was ripped from its seat and hurled directly to starboard, leaving Q turret inverted on the seabed roughly 45 meters from where it had stood inside the ship. Around it, lighter wreckage and burning debris were flung across the anchorage with terrifying force. In a matter of seconds, the great ship was simply gone, plunging quickly to the bottom of the harbor and taking 843 men down into the dark water with it. Only 2 crew members survived the catastrophic night. A Royal Navy Board of Inquiry was immediately convened to understand how a fully functional dreadnought could instantly vaporize its own midsection. Because the entire center of the ship was completely obliterated, the exact origin of the disaster remains permanently unprovable. The Royal Navy Court could only say that cordite had ignited from an avoidable cause, or that deteriorated cordite may have played a part. Later researchers and the wreck survey point to the same broad danger zone. Heat from a bunker, patent fuel space, or adjacent compartment may have passed through the steel around the midships magazines until the cordite reached a fatal condition. Once cordite in one magazine ignited, it could drive a catastrophic magazine explosion, not a neat single detonation of individual charges, but a sudden, violent burning and bursting of enormous propellant stocks. The expanding gases and fireball would have forced their way upward through the armored decks and outward through the steel hull, tearing the 19,000-ton war machine into fragmented pieces before anyone on board could sound a final alarm or attempt an evacuation. The extreme violence of that midnight detonation is permanently and clearly recorded on the silent seabed today. For decades, the exact physical condition of the sunken dreadnought was known only through murky, limited reports from deep divers, but a highly restricted centenary survey between 2016 and 2017 finally revealed the staggering scale of the destruction. Operating under a rare, specialized license from the Secretary of State for Defense, maritime archaeologists and specialist divers used side-scan sonar, underwater mapping, video, still photography, and three-dimensional photogrammetry to document the wreck and its wider debris field. The resulting high-resolution data stripped away the dark water and exposed a haunting, violent underwater landscape. 111 feet below the yellow warning buoy, the battleship does not look like a traditional ship at all. The central explosion was so absolute that the heavy steel bow and the stern are now lying 163 meters apart on the ocean floor. Between them is a violent gap in the main wreck site where the midships magazines once sat, a pattern that strongly supports, rather than perfectly proves, the Royal Navy inquiry and later survey interpretation of a cordite magazine explosion. Despite the destruction of the center hull, the survey identified the remaining structures of all 5 12-inch turrets, stripped of most shield armor, barbette armor, and gun barrels, and scattered across the underwater debris field. Some of these surviving turret structures still sit upright in the silt, while others were thrown sideways or overturned from their original mountings. Scattered among the twisted steel hull plates and the collapsed bulkheads are some empty and damaged brass Clarkson cordite cases, especially around the former magazine areas, silent evidence of the ammunition system rather than objects that can be pinned to one exact falling point. The high-resolution acoustic mapping shows a violent crime scene frozen perfectly in time, capturing the exact terrifying moment the dreadnought was torn apart by its own internal fire. But the chaotic, highly disturbed layout of the seabed tells a second, much darker story, one that is completely invisible from the surface and directly explains why the site is so heavily guarded by strict law today. The heavily mangled and scattered condition of the wreckage is not entirely the pure result of the 1917 magazine explosion. The silent debris field hides a much more recent, deliberate human violation. From 1957 into the 1970s, before the wreck received full controlled site protection, the sunken battleship was legally exposed to commercial salvage. During that post-war period, salvage rights were sold to private operators, and the wreck was treated less like a protected grave than a source of recoverable metal. The evidence on the seabed is blunt. Propellers, turbine machinery, condensers, armor plate, gun barrels, and smaller non-ferrous objects were removed, and at least one exploratory blast hole was later recorded near the aft torpedo tube. The work was commercial, legal, and deeply damaging, but the documented record is uneven rather than a clean story of one continuous operation driven to an end by public outrage. The old salvage era faded, but legal protection arrived in stages rather than in a single stroke. In 1984, the wreck was officially recognized as a war grave. In 1986, the Protection of Military Remains Act created the legal framework for protecting military wrecks. In 2002, HMS Vanguard itself became a controlled site, closing the wreck to unauthorized diving. And in 2026, the present controlled area was expanded to 350 meters from the designated point because the debris field had proven wider than the older boundary. The designation transformed the site from a vulnerable salvage target into a protected military grave. Today, unauthorized diving, salvage, excavation, recovery of objects, or disturbance inside the controlled site is forbidden, while rare licensed work can still be approved for survey, conservation, safety, or commemoration. The danger is not best described as unexploded cordite waiting everywhere in the silt. Official records point instead to a protected war grave, possible remaining ordnance, and a stern section that should not be disturbed. The strict legal wall around the ruined dreadnought is absolute, but the human attempt to freeze the wreckage in time is slowly and inevitably being defeated by the natural world. The ocean does not recognize the boundary of the yellow warning buoy, and it does not respect the authority of the 1986 legislation. Inside the quiet exclusion zone, the long, slow, irreversible process of marine reclamation continues completely undisturbed by the world above. During a highly rare, legally permitted dive by a Royal Navy team in 2009, a pristine white ensign flag was carefully and respectfully placed over a section of the rusted steel to honor the hundreds of fallen crew members. When the Specialized Archaeological Survey team returned to map the debris field 8 years later, they found the memorial flag again. It was no longer the sharp, bright symbol that had been lowered into the darkness years before. The survey team found it covered in marine growth and popular with starfish, a human tribute already being absorbed into the living skin of the wreck. The ocean had completely consumed the human tribute, just as it is slowly and relentlessly consuming the empty brass cordite cases, the massive gun turrets, and the severed bow. The great warship that once aggressively represented the absolute pinnacle of human engineering and the strict military law that now guards its final resting place are both slowly yielding to the permanent, cold darkness of the deep harbor. Up on the surface, the bright yellow buoy continues to watch over the dark water, warning the living to stay far away. But down in the quiet, crushing depths of Scapa Flow, the shattered dreadnought belongs entirely to the sea.